like to welcome back Gerstell and Rick Ledgett, who are going to co-moderate the session on the situation facing CISOs today. Where should their focus be? Does it need to be on defending themselves or defending their organizations? How do you do both? Aaron Hughes is joining us. He is the CISO of Albertsons. Rich Baich is the CISO of AT&T. John Carlin is former U.S. Acting Deputy Attorney General, who is now in private practice as a partner at Paul Weiss. I want to turn it over to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Rick and I are going to co-moderate this, and I'm going to start off, and then Rick can correct me and lead us down the right road here. But what I thought we would do is let me just paint a little bit of a picture for the backdrop for our three distinguished panelists to talk about, who have a wealth of experience in not only the public sector, but the private sector as well in terms of dealing with some of these issues. So my opening comment would just simply be to note that although the first CISO role probably was created in the late 1990s, and so it's what, almost 3 decades old perhaps, in the last 20 years, I can't think of any other senior corporate job that has undergone such a transformational change as that one in terms of the relations in the C-suite, the scope of responsibilities, and as we'll hear shortly, some concerns over potential for liability, the role of the job, its position within the larger enterprise. This, of course, this change, this fundamental, very transformational change, is in reaction to a rather external, dynamic cyber environment with many factors that lead to that, but principally two: one, the increased risk, and two, the increased program of regulation, governmental involvement in the sector. Anyone listening to this Cipher Brief program today doesn't need much of a description of the increased risk piece, so I'll skip over that obviously, but I just will note that this year, US and multinational organizations in the United States are expected to spend over $200 billion on cybersecurity, and yet, as we see, that isn't sufficient. The number of reported material data breaches in the last year alone was well over 3,000, almost an 80% increase from the prior year. We're seeing constantly increased amount of ever more sophisticated ransomware attacks, nation-state attacks, supply chain attacks, et cetera. Again, don't need to elaborate that. On the government action side, following the promulgation of the National Cyber Strategy, the work of the Solarium Commission, we're seeing more and more of a movement toward government involvement in regulating the private sector's activities in cyber. Part of that, of course, is the upcoming regulations for DHS in the cyber reporting area, but the SEC, and that's what we're going to be focused on most for the next half hour, 45 minutes, has itself gone ahead with rules that became effective last December, which we'll get into, about public disclosures of cybersecurity posture of companies and a new reporting requirement. And then somewhat to the alarm of much of industry, a stepped up increase in enforcement with a number of one particular noticeable action growing out of these SolarWinds incident. So what I thought I'd do is stop there with that just opening comment about how this has transformed the role of CISOs. And then Rick, I know you've got some thoughts too, and then maybe we could turn to Rich and then Aaron and then John.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Glenn. It's good to see you. John, Aaron, thanks for being here. It's good to see you both. I would just add to what Glenn said just a little bit and say that the good news is people are paying attention to cybersecurity in a way that they haven't before. The bad news is they're paying attention to cybersecurity in a way they haven't before, and with that comes all the bad stuff. Depending on your point of view, increased attention from a legal point of view, and there's also at the same time there's been a transition. A couple of years ago, when I interacted with companies, CISOs were generally guys who were working level cybersecurity experts who could make a good presentation in front of the board, but would be happy to talk all day about IP addresses, indicators of compromise, and things like that. That's phasing out. Now CISOs are genuine corporate officers who get the big picture, who talk about business risk first, and then work their way down either directly or through subordinates into the gazintas and gazoutas of the cybersecurity details themselves. And so I think those two things together have also contributed to this environment that Glenn's described. And with that, I'll just stop and turn it back over to Glenn.
Okay, good. At least on my computer screen, I don't see Rich, but I assume he's on or not.
I don't think he's on. I don't see him on the attendee list.
Okay, well, then we're going to move to Aaron and take advantage of your expertise. Given what Rick and I have just described as sort of the environment, can you tell us how you're thinking about the transformed role of a CISO? What in particular are you focusing on, and how are you within the organization adjusting your role to these new increased regulatory requirements? And maybe you can in particular talk about, because I know we're going to ask John to do the same, the question of SEC reporting in particular.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Great to be here today and see some former colleagues and friends. I think both of you highlighted the role of what I'd say a Fortune 500 CISO is, right? One that is very much focused on enabling and safeguarding the business, understanding business imperatives, engaging the board. But I do think there is a large proportion of CISOs that are what fall into the category of what Rick just described as explicitly focused on security engineering. So there's this sort of great divide of CISOs that are really trying to get their teams to sort of understand how security is an enabler. And there's still sort of a large proportion that are only interested in the security tooling and sort of the compliance dimension. So I think that's an important delineation as we talk about the role of the CISO. I think there is not a single, I would even expand, Fortune 1000 CEO or board that does not want a business leader in the CISO role. And I think that'll, be a characteristic that is, described as sort of CISOs are building teams and sort of vetting responsibilities. First and foremost, making sure that you're enabling the business. In terms of sort of the regulatory environment, to me, that sort of has always been apparent, always part of it. Just depends on sort of the industry that you're in. I've worked in government, I've worked in financial services, I currently work in retail, and so there's different regulatory bodies that you need to appease and inform about your processes. You need to make sure you have good understanding of the controls that are related to the key regulatory data or data sources that are most important for running your business. And as you sort of delineate and explain sort of the risk of protecting those data sources. Now, in terms of how the regulatory environment's changing the mindset of the CISO, again, not to be sort of dismissive of the question, but I think it's the regulatory environment of the C-suite is responsible for. Like I think there are conversations that CISOs are in and day out around what we're willing to sort of attest in sort of SEC filings that companies need to make. What you need to sort of explain and describe to different committees on the board, where funding is appropriate, and sort of all of that goes into making sure corporates are staying in line with the various compliance environments that are out there.
Are you finding in that regard that you're spending a fair amount of time on being in a position to defend the organization, and for that matter yourself, but the organization generally, in the event something goes wrong, as opposed to at the time dealing with ongoing problems? How much time is, to use the technical legal term, involved in CYA, so to speak?
It's, and again, I sort of hate to say like it depends, but I'd say the vast majority of security programs are again well-resourced, well-funded, and have the support of the C-suite and the board to make the right investments. That's not to say we're sort of investing like drunken sailors, but we're sort of able to articulate where the next security dollar helps to burn down the most exigent business risk. And I think that's sort of the correlation that boards and C-suites are looking for, because they do want to show the diligence that they've funded the security program, so you aren't in a CYA instance. I think sort of the vast majority of CISOs go to the board and go to the C-suite with a factual assessment of where risks are present. That are going to go out there and tell a muddled risk story, because it does everyone a disservice. It does the CISO a disservice, because something bad is always going to happen. It does the board and the CEO a disservice because it gives a false sense of security. So I'd say, from my position, I don't lead with the CYA. I lead with sort of the facts of what risks are apparent and what we're trying to invest to continue to support the business.
Rick, did you have a comment, or can we move to John?
Yeah, no, I think what Aaron says makes a lot of sense. And I also think that his comment about the difference between, Fortune 100 or 500 and small and medium businesses is a really important one that we can't lose sight of.
John, it's good to see you again. You've got a perspective, as does Aaron, from both the public and private sector. But now that you're back in the private sector, what are you hearing from your clients, and how? And because you were so involved in some cyber policy issues when you were in the Department of Justice, can you talk about what you're seeing now in terms of as your clients who are CISOs themselves? What are they saying? What are they concerned about? How do they view the role? And then, if I'd like to also spend some time on the SEC rule in particular.
Sounds good. So I'll wait to follow up on the SEC rule. We'll start with, although I agree with much as what has been said, I think I might disagree with both Rick and Aaron on some of what you describe about the role of the CISO. I think is the right role to aim for, and is certainly the type of CISO that now boards, particularly larger companies, are seeking, but present company excluded, I don't know that they're finding it. So I still think that there is a disconnect between the phenomenal technical expertise that many people have in the CISO role, and then speaking the language of risk in a way that the business side of the house, and particularly boards of directors, can understand. There's still that disconnect, and I'm seeing it with clients on both sides being frustrated, both clients when they are boards or the general counsel, not fully understanding what the CISO is trying to tell them about risk, and from the CISO feeling like they're not being heard and looking for training. And there are more trainings on it, on what is a different expertise than understanding the bits and bytes and where the investment dollars should actually go. And Aaron, I think you phrased it well in terms of what it should be, which would be allowing that informed conversation about what each dollar is buying you as you're trying to spend down risk. This is a strange place, putting on my government hat, it is a strange place for enforcement and otherwise, hey Rich, in that the victim here is the company, and yet the company who is the victim of criminal actors, nation state actors, and nation states where our traditional tools have not been particularly effective at deterring the activity. And specifically Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, since we've pivoted, remain very active. I think there's been an enormous change in how the government's pursuing those actors in terms of making public what they're finding, sharing it even privately with members of the private sector faster than ever before, and seeking to impose pain on the adversary through innovative techniques that are often are interagency in terms of the authorities being used, but doing things like hacking the hacker in Colonial Pipeline and stealing lawfully from from the wallet where the victim had paid off our ransomware, or in Hive, another very prevalent ransomware attacker secretly stealing the decryption keys from the bad actor, and then without actually really legal compulsion, sharing with legal counsel and with the companies who were hit by Hive the fact that they had the decryption key. And so Hive couldn't figure out for about a 6-month period of time why no one was paying the ransomware to get back their key. And then they're also doing things like using legal authorities in a new way, particularly the long-standing tool in US law of the search warrant. But instead of using it simply to search to find evidence of the crime, they've been using it once they've obtained back-end access to the attacker's tools, so particularly a botnet where there's some type of command and control. They're using that access plus a court order to go in and do things like change default passwords to try to make victims more secure. I think that's a good trend. That trend fundamentally relies on, it started with communication between the tech side and the business side on risk inside a company. The success of this new pivot in government really relies on successful communication with companies, including the business and tech side, on what hurts them most as victims, and so what the government should be most concerned about from the government on what they're seeing in terms of threat, and being able to provide back to the private sector. Give that all as a backdrop, Glenn, because this is where I think I'm curious, and we have two very experienced CISOs with us today, with both Aaron and Rich. But what I've heard from some, and recognizing that there is this, I think some CISOs are much more mature and really are a part of the business senior leadership team. And in other companies, they have the title with a C, but they're not actually in the C-suite discussions. They're not formally an officer of the company. That means they don't necessarily have all the protections. It's one thing to take a look at and make sure you're indemnified like an officer would be. Because if they call you one, whether you have that formal role or not, it is clear that the enforcement agency is looking at you as if you are an officer now, if you have that O in the title, even though if you're not at a publicly company in an actual officer position. But I think one of the things to look at, and this is where we weighed in on behalf of a lot of former government officials in one of the prime enforcement actions that's taken place now, the SEC case in SolarWinds, which was a case where there was a very sophisticated foreign adversary who hacked into a company and then used that access to hack into other companies. The SEC in that case, enforcement action in the first of its kind, was against both the company and against the CISO personally. And so one of the flags we had in that case, curious as you guys see inform you, is when it comes to that critical information sharing decision early in an incident where you may not have categorized how severe the incident is going to be at the company, the fact that you could be second guessed later as to whether or not you disclose that information publicly is chilling, I think, some CISOs from going in to have conversations with the law enforcement and intelligence agencies for whom that conversation is critical for their ability to take action. And I don't even know that, in my experience, it's not always the CISO on their own. They actually would still like to have the conversation, but their own legal counsel inside the company is saying, whoa, we may get asked later to turn over anything that you've turned over now. So at a minimum, before you do it, we need to think through, should we be disclosing this publicly, et cetera. That causes delay. And in some cases, they're saying, I don't see that much upside to us as one victim, even though it might help the collective whole, to have that conversation versus the potential downside where that information could be used against us in an enforcement action.
Just following up on that for a minute, John, is your, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but is your sense that this type of enforcement action in this particular case is ultimately counterproductive to the cybersecurity effort?
I think it's a concern. And remember that, to be fair to the SEC as the regulator, they actually are not tasked with being concerned about the larger cybersecurity effort or about improving cybersecurity within companies. They're tasked solely with the job of getting information to shareholders that will be relevant to their risk decision and whether or not to invest in a company. And so while that may have effects that help improve cybersecurity, I think, Aaron and Rich can certainly, I think some of the funding and that you get from the board, et cetera, is incentivized by the fact that there is competition. And but in this space, I don't really think it's once you understand the risk to business interruption, it's not so much the disclosure to shareholders that, in my experience, publicly traded companies are trying to get right. They're trying to get right the risk calculus so they either don't suffer the business interruption or get resilience back on track. I don't know that they need that extra incentive if you were if that was the prime purpose. And the other thing, Glenn, is the enforcement action came right as they were doing a rulemaking and putting in a new rule. And although the new rule is not actually linked to the SolarWinds enforcement action, in other words, it's not a product of the new rule, it came before the new rule was in effect. The new rule had CISOs already, and other members of companies scratching their heads a little bit because the materiality analysis that's laid out in the new rule is the same determination of materiality that existed before the rule and already would apply to cyber along with any other material risk.
Sure.
But they got called out here as a new rule for cybersecurity. And then similarly, they imposed a 4-day disclosure requirement that says within 4 days after you make a determination of that an incident is material, that you need to disclose it. That also was the same rule for materiality for non-cyber risk. So there was a question of, well, there were a lot of proposed changes to the rule that did not go into effect. And so one question is, well, what exactly did change? Talking to the SEC folks who wrote the rule and statements that they've made afterwards, actually one of the prime purposes, and curious there, and Rich, what do you think in terms of the effect from their point of view, was they did not feel that there was sufficient conversation between the technologists in companies and those who own the business risk. And even though this was longstanding, they were marrying that up with the fact that when they talk with C-suite executives about what keeps you up at night, the top risk for them was often cybersecurity. And they were not seeing that reflected in disclosures. And so their view was, even though this might be similar to the framework that already existed, we are telling you that the importance we see of cybersecurity as a risk, and therefore people who may not have thought much about or be included on the disclosure committee like other officers, the CISOs, we want to make very clear that they need to be a part of that conversation. That's their goal. And then there's a question of whether that succeeded or over-succeeded by chilling.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, I think your point is well said, but the irony behind a lot of these discussions to me today is all public companies make risk decisions all day long, right? So do they buy down debt? Do they increase their dividend? Do they buy back shares? How they choose to use their equity is a choice by the organization. So when it comes to the kind of the cyber approach, right, as CISOs, the best thing that we can do is provide factual information in the right context, to the appropriate leadership that is authorized to make those particular decisions as it relates to risk management. When you break down what we do as chief information security officers, we manage and implement controls which try to mitigate a known risk to the organization within its own defined risk appetite. And I think that is a fair model when done and communicated properly. And in the instance of a a breach or something else like that, it's very similar to what happens if you don't have the funds for what you projected for your investment statement. How are you going to describe it, and what changes do we make? Like you said, the SEC's focus is around fair and equitable treatment of its shareholders. So I think we've gone astray not to go back to that same basis and what cybersecurity and information security means as part of a company's responsibility, to its shareholders. So, when I'm talking with fellow CISOs today, that is the advice that I'm giving them: is provide the information, define and have agreed upon risk appetite, work to manage within that risk appetite as defined by the organization, and then as incidents occur, based on whatever the regulatory or lawful guidance is, you declare that. And but again, if those practices are in place, my assumption is that's what the SEC is trying to drive as far as what they're doing with regard to this enforcement. The challenge is, in traditional finance, they've defined what is good and acceptable practices, but in cyber, they really haven't defined what good and acceptable practices are, other than, hey, you need to disclose the incident. The incident isn't necessarily the issue that, in this particular case, the SEC should be focusing on, because it's supposed to be focusing on shareholder value.
And of course, in retrospect, it's going to be easy for at least a zealous regulator to go back and say, whatever practices you had weren't sufficient, and you failed to disclose that fact, of course, with 20/20 hindsight, and make a case out of it. Obviously, having said that, there certainly are situations we can envision where there is an egregious failure to disclose and failure to provide investors with the right information. And so clearly there is still room for enforcement at some level. But Rick, I know you had some points too, and I didn't want to preempt any of that.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to ask, what about, so if I understand the situation with the SolarWinds CISO correctly, the allegation is that what he said internally, what he said externally didn't match up. He had conversations and documented, and that was surfaced, and it was there was a less than stellar situation inside the company, but it was represented up to leadership as okay. And so how do you address that in your organizations? How do you have a frank conversation about where you are with cybersecurity, at the same time realizing that you need to protect, or you need to worry about the potential for a regulator to coming in after an event and turfing up these old emails and surfacing them? I mean, do you have a way to address that?
I mean, I would say we certainly, internal to my program, use that as an example as how all forms of communication, email, Slack, Teams, et cetera, are all discoverable. And while you might want to joke with colleagues, if you are going to say something like, our security program is a house on fire, we have all this risk, as the CISO, I have to do something about that. I have to take that seriously. And I think it really sort of, especially for maybe the more junior employees, the younger employees that didn't have the context around how, written statements and written things matter, it was a big sort of wake up call. We had sort of folks from our general counsel team do a explanation of attorney-client privilege and communication. So we sort of leveraged sort of what was in the public discourse around SolarWinds to sort of inform our team to really be cautious about what's put in internal corporate chat and email, et cetera. So we definitely leveraged that.
I'm sure we all have our favorite emails that we saw that we couldn't believe someone actually clicked send on.
That's a great practice, I think, Aaron. One of the things I always advise when we're in an incident is, even though there's a lot going on, have that refresher 5 minutes during the incident of everyone's moving really quickly, but to Rich's point earlier, let's stick to the facts here to save speculation for later. And yeah, no jokes that don't feel fun when they're being read back to you in a deposition.
Yeah. And I would like to, I mean, I know Rich wasn't on, you weren't on when I spoke, but like your comment about facts, controls, and risk was exactly the same thing. You know, so it goes to show like running a security program is not sort of novel or bespoke, right? You know, Rich and his implementation at AT&T, or, you know, prior, what I'm trying to do at Albertsons companies, all about providing sort of senior manager the facts around the risk we're trying to address and how that affects our business operations and continuity.
Yeah, and again, I think that one of the the biggest things that CISOs really need to kind of come away with, and some lessons learned and just good practices are risk decisions are made every day, and our job is to provide the facts with the context associated with cyber threats and what does that risk mean to the appropriate individuals, and that all needs to be defined. And then when a decision is made, you document and then you go execute, off of it. I've never been in a conversation with regulators or anybody else where if the issue's been identified and there's been a timeline and you can demonstrate there's a program around it and you can demonstrate what the maturation level that you as your organization are accepting, you go away and you execute on it. The regulator's job is not to require us to do ABC unless it's explicitly defined in the regulation. I mean, when you say have a good security program, that's open to interpretation. Now, if you're going to go and say you're required to have MFA for A, B, and C, well, then you can measure that explicitly, kind of associated with it. And the challenge is, just like the SEC saying material, right? What does material mean? Again, not my job to define materiality. That's more of a kind of a legal discussion, and I'll execute, upon that. But again, a big part of this is really about, and again, if my discussions with regulators through the years, it is an organization's job to manage their risk. So as long as they are demonstrating they have good risk management practices and decisioning around it, then it's aligned with what the organization is doing. So I think that's also, lessons learned, right, from some of the things that we're seeing is did they follow the exact process? Was it the accepted process? Was it defined like a policy? And the execution on it, and the measurement of it. So whether like Aaron said, controls, measurement, guidelines, operating ranges, all those things are the most important. There's no such thing. I'll challenge anybody who says they don't have an internet-facing high vulnerability today, right? Because they could say that right now, and a new vulnerability is released 2 minutes from now, and it takes time. But you come up with what is a acceptable, manageable range, and management manages to that, and the board governs to that.
I'll throw in a couple other, curious for thoughts, practical things given our topic of how to protect the CISO, and what's certainly a job that's getting a lot of attention these days from regulators and others. But so one is just, again, going back on they're not necessarily actually officers point, check to see what your policies are on indemnification. And what you want to make sure is that your indemnification kicks in so that you have funds to hire an attorney while they continue to work through their process. So you want to be fronted, so you're not ever facing the stress of paying for your own counsel for work you did on behalf of the company. Two is linked to the documentation point that both Rich and Aaron have raised, and this is something I do see sometimes get lost in the the flurry of responding to an incident is encourage the team that you've informed to make sure that they document the fact, particularly early in an incident, that you have not concluded one way or the other whether something is material. And so that includes memorializing what you told them at the time, because I think it was Glenn, the 2020 hindsight issue, that if that turns into to be a terrible incident and you just didn't know the first week, I think Rich is right. That's a perfectly defensible argument, but what lacks sometimes is the documentation that it occurred. And it's easier to document when you're not in the middle of a crisis, but they've made clear now that they're expecting that some type of documentation that you went through that thought process. That can be a little bit different than other types of materiality determinations where you usually have a little more time and your systems are working, so it's a little easier to document depending on how severe the incident is. And a third, and this is what has caused concern again with the SolarWinds enforcement action rather than the new rule, which would be they're looking at statements that were not traditionally what you would think were shareholder-facing statements. So they've called out a blog, they've called out comments made internally versus assurances made externally to customers rather than shareholders about the security program. And so there, I think it is a documentation and control issue, but it's important that the fact that you failed on some self-imposed control, or to use the example of X was supposed to have dual factor, did not, to make sure that that's in an overall risk setting, and your overall risk that you've documented with the board may still be green, or your statement may still be true. But it does mean you need to be more cautious now with statements that you make in the blog, in the pod today. If we were to ask you about it on a podcast, that those could be used against you if they seem like they are different than what you're otherwise telling your shareholders. And that's the area where I worry a little bit might chill you in, and that was our brief in your conversations with law enforcement or intel, where you're trying to be candid in an uncertain environment in a way that you wouldn't phrase it the same way if it was a public statement, that was vetted for the overall risk of the company.
Looks like we've got just a handful of minutes left. I've got one sort of very quick question that I'd be interested in the reaction of everyone, including Rick as your co-moderator here, because you deal a lot with board of directors. But I was talking to a headhunter yesterday who said that they get a sort of a sense of duality or ambivalence from some boards who on one hand are saying, we need more cyber expertise. We need someone who could really understand what it is that the chief security information officer is reporting to the board. And yet at the same time, a sense that, well, we don't really want to have a board composed of just particular experts in any one particular area, whether it's cyber or anything else. We want people who have seasoned business judgment and able to make appropriate risk allocations and are financially literate, of course. Do any of you have any reaction to where you see boards going in that particular area? And I'll just conclude. I won't say any more. Rick, I'll just hand it back to you, and you can wrap us up after a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think Rick's going to close. So, look, it is a risk discipline within the organization that has a component of audit, risk management, and technology. I've seen boards have a separate technology element where cyber is discussed. I've seen it do it when it's in an audit committee. I've seen it be done in a risk committee. So there's no standard way. I think it's kind of cultural in nature to the organization. But I think boards should be looking for somebody who can bring that combination in of understanding the impact of cyber, right? And from a business standpoint, from a risk standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, And as far as this profession goes, right, there's not many that have MBAs or anything else in place. But having that as a board element, whether that's on the board or whether they hire an individual once a year to come in to review their program and give a statement of assurance to the board about it, is another potential avenue to go. But I think the forward-leaning boards are either looking for that well-rounded person or bringing in that external, as if they were a board member, advice to review the program and give them an independent view.
Yeah, I would say most of my CISO colleagues that are on boards view themselves as risk executives first and foremost. Come from a variety of industries, depth of technology experience and business acumen. I think where you see CISOs struggle that desire to be on boards is where they lead purely from a technical standpoint. And maybe that's sort of relevant if you are a sort of security product company or a technology company, but the vast majority of companies seeking to diversify their boards are looking for risk executives, much in the same way they've looked for certified financial experts to fill audit committee chair and other roles.
Yep. John, did you have a comment on that too?
No, agree with the comments, and I know we're at time.
All right, I'll pass it back to Rick Ledgett, and you can wrap up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I would just say that I've seen boards express interest in hiring people like that. I've seen a much smaller number of actual board members hired like that. And it may be that they're doing some consulting that I'm not aware of. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks for being on the call, Rich and John and Aaron, although I think Aaron's gone. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for addressing this this important topic. And Glenn, as always, you were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you all.